Right, well, my name is Dr Shonagh Dillon. I'm Chief Executive at an organisation called Aurora New Dawn, which is a support and advocacy service for victims of domestic abuse, sexual violence and stalking. And I'm also a director at Women's Place UK. And I have the great privilege of introducing Dr Emma Milne. She's an Associate Professor in Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at Durham University. Her research focuses on criminal law and criminal justice responses to infant killing and fetal harm. The wider context of Emma's work is social controls and regulations of all women, notably in relation to pregnancy, sex, and motherhood. Welcome, Emma. I'm so excited about speaking to you tonight. So,
thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here too.
I'm really excited. Okay. So can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to research this area of work? So I think that's a really interesting story that you didn't necessarily kind of seek this out.
No, not at all. So I started in a sociology department, and the aim of my PhD was to think about how do we as a society respond to women who are violent, and how do we understand the violence of women, because it's not something that women often do. Violence is much more the domain of men. Women are much more likely to be victims of male violence than they are to commit their own acts of violence. So my supervisor and I had this really odd conversation where we picked a crime, which genuinely was one of the most bizarre things I've ever done, of listing terrible things that people do and deciding which one to pick, and landed on infanticide. And genuinely thought that I was going to be looking at the Infanticide Act and, what happens when women kill babies after birth. And then through the research and through the study, it became really clear that actually the law is not as clear-cut as it's meant to be. So the law is meant to say if you are born alive and you're a live-born person, then you could be a victim of homicide. But if you're not born alive, you can't be a victim of any of those crimes, because that's the principle of English criminal law that's been upheld for centuries now. But when I started looking at cases, actually what became clear is that there is this group of women who experience crisis pregnancies, which we're going to come on to discuss in a moment. And the baby, whether it's a fetus, baby, interesting question around language there, at some point that baby dies, but there's not always necessarily evidence of when it died. So it could have died before birth, it could have died during birth, or it could have died after birth. But if the prosecution can't prove that, but they want to criminalize her, they have to start getting a bit creative about which criminal laws they use. And this is where the offences of procuring a miscarriage and concealment of birth come in, and why they've been the focus of a big part of my research.
So tell me a bit more about that, because, in terms of those kind of pieces of legislation, what does that mean? What does procuring a miscarriage and concealment of birth, what does that mean, and where does that come from?
So procuring a miscarriage, people are probably much more aware of this now since the case in June. Procuring a miscarriage is the criminal offence of ending a pregnancy, essentially. So it falls under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, section 58, which states that any woman who ends her own pregnancy or procures her own miscarriage at any point in pregnancy is committing a criminal offence and will be subject to imprisonment for up to life for that. Concealment of birth is a far less well-known criminal offence. It is the concealment of the dead body of a baby to hide the fact that baby was ever born. And it's a piece of legislation that first came into force in 1803, but the most recent iteration that we have today also sits under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. And this is a really handy piece of law for prosecutors, because essentially all they have to prove is that the woman hid the dead body. So if they think she's killed a baby or a fetus or done something to harm the fetus, they don't have to prove any of that in order to use this piece of legislation. They can simply demonstrate that she hid the body after the death of the baby. So both of these pieces of legislation together allow for what I call the workaround the born alive rule. So no longer do they have to prove that the baby was born alive in order to convict women when they think harm has been done. Instead, they've got these alternative offences that they can use if the right circumstances are in place. So obviously procuring a miscarriage, they have to be able to demonstrate that she's taken steps to end her own pregnancy. Whereas for concealment of birth, as I say, they only have to demonstrate that she's hidden the dead body.
Okay. We'll get on to sort of the purpose of why those laws were created, I think, because I find that really interesting, that actually it wasn't necessarily the purpose that it's been used for now. But if you could you tell me about, obviously you've written a book, and you've heavily researched this area. Can you tell me a bit about some of those cases, how you came up with the term crisis pregnancy, what you found in those cases, if you can give me some examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the cases I looked at, they cross this span of when the baby died. So dying because of a woman ending her own pregnancy, dying during labour, or dying after labour. And the aim of that was to really try and understand the different ways in which the law is being utilised and what laws are being used. But the one thing that is common across all of these cases, whilst they might have very different outcomes. So within the book, I talk about women who were convicted of murder. I talk about women who were convicted of concealment of birth, and women who were convicted of procuring a miscarriage. So very different legal outcomes with very different punishments attached to them. But the one thing that is absolutely the same across them is women who are in crisis. So we are talking about a situation where a woman probably has a pre-existing life crisis happening. So we're talking about women who are living within violence and abusive relationships. That could be with a partner, but it could also be with family. We're talking about women who are living in absolute abject poverty, potentially, terrified of, if people find out she's pregnant, what will happen next. Women who are dealing with drug and alcohol, substance misuse. So really, really desperate situations. And then the pregnancy then adds into a crisis. Effectively, it causes an extra crisis on top. So to give you one example, one of the women who I look at in the book, and I use pseudonyms in the book, one of the women, Hayley, this was her fifth pregnancy. And this pregnancy followed 4 before. The first one, she turned up in A&E in labour, had no idea she was pregnant, and gave birth that evening. The second pregnancy, she found out incredibly late, but she was just under 24 weeks, so she was able to access an abortion through legal means. Her next 2 pregnancies, again, she found out incredibly late. One of those, again, she found out after turning up in A&E to give birth without knowing that she was pregnant. So that just, it gives you an indication of the sort of situation we're talking about. This is not a callous woman who, really wants to get pregnant because she wants to kill a late-term fetus. This is a woman who, for some reason, her mind and her body is not able to conceptualize that she is pregnant. And I know that probably seems very odd, particularly to anyone who has been pregnant, because certainly from friends who've been pregnant, it sounds like a condition that is quite hard to ignore. But I think when you are in that level of crisis and that level of difficulty, it's quite remarkable what steps the body and the mind can take in order to protect the self from the reality, which is there's a pregnancy that has to be dealt with. And I think that's often what's misunderstood in these cases, because women can and are reported to have moments of lucidity where they are clearly aware they're pregnant. So they might do something like Google, what happens if I take night nurse? So that's one example from another girl in the case, in the book. Her case, she's only 16 at the time that this is happening. So we are very much talking about a girl. So there was evidence from her laptop that she did have these moments of lucidity. She was kind of searching, how do I end my pregnancy? How do I, get rid of this baby? Things like that. But then what then equally happens is the kind of the stress and the horror of the fact that these women are pregnant when they just can't accept they are, and it's this unbearable crisis, is they suppress it, and they don't, they can't acknowledge it, they can't take steps to address it. And then you end up in one of two situations, really. You end up with either the woman will take steps to illegally end the pregnancy, or the woman will, and in Tanya's case, this is what happened, go into labour on their own. Usually it's in a bathroom, usually it's on the toilet because they think they're actually having a bowel movement, and they end up giving birth alone, which can only be a terrifying experience, I'm sure.
Yeah, and obviously being 16, and I think we've chatted before about you know, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert in trauma by any means, but, you know, the victims that we work with at Aurora, you know, it is amazing what the body and the mind does when you're experiencing a deep level of trauma and how your body responds to that. So I think, you know, particularly in those cases that you studied, you know, the term crisis pregnancy does really make sense because, you know, with lots of obviously abusive relationships, you know, there are ways and means that you have to survive, don't you, to be able to kind of navigate your life, and that's really difficult. Out of interest, have you ever come across during your research any woman that got pregnant just to access a late term, to end a pregnancy late term? You know,
No.
they've been running around, you know, just getting pregnant so that they can have a late term abortion or termination.
Yeah, sorry, I'm laughing here. I'm not meaning to make light of this at all, but it's no, those women just don't exist. It's an absurd idea. Every case I look at, this is a crisis. There is absolutely no doubt about it. You know, and I think it's important for us to think about and acknowledge that women's acts of violence are incredibly different to men's acts of violence, so both quantitatively and qualitatively. So whereas we know men, you know, they are at times sadistic in their violence, they enjoy it, right? That's so rare for a woman to be in that situation. It's so rare. Even in the cases of the most extreme child abuse that women are involved in, it's so rare that it's going to be because of sadistic enjoyment of violence. And it's certainly not the case in these sorts of crisis pregnancy cases that I look into. I think there's feminist work that's been done on this. A great American scholar called Lorna Schneider in particular talks about this, that because feminism, second wave feminism, was so keen to demonstrate that women are as capable as men, the kind of flip side of that is, well, in that case, we must be as capable of the really bad things that men do as well. And of course, you're going to get the odd woman who is, but they really are a complete oddity. This is not a norm of female and feminine behavior. And I think something that wider society generally, but then also the criminal justice system, I think is failing to take into appreciation is that women's offending is just not the same as men's. And so to suggest that we should be approached and punished in the same way, I think is just misguided.
So going back to the reasons why those pieces of legislation had come about in Victorian era, why were they, from your research, what have you found? Were they there to prevent what's happening now, or was there a different reason for those laws coming about?
Yeah, so I think I'll focus on procuring a miscarriage here, because concealment at birth has got its own very long and what I think is interesting history, but I think it will take us a little bit off the focus of tonight. So procuring a miscarriage was brought in first in 1803. And interestingly, when it came in 1803, women couldn't be criminalized under this piece of legislation. So right. It had, prior to this, the crime of abortion had been a case law, a common law criminal offence, but there's very, very little, if any at all, evidence that women were actually criminalized under it. And when they were criminalized, it was often in the context of an extramarital affair. So they were being criminalized for fornication as well as procuring a miscarriage. So there was this real sense that actually the concern was much more about them having an extramarital affair rather than the ending of the pregnancy. So there was a very different conceptual understanding of pregnancy, of fetuses, and of women's steps to control their reproduction, essentially. So, you know, taking herbs to bring on a period was quite a normal thing to be doing, kind of prior to the 1800s into the 1800s. And then as the 1800s goes on, this piece of legislation that criminalizes procuring a miscarriage adds women in. We're not entirely certain what that is, but what we are confident of is that the legislation was not written to protect fetuses, but rather it was written to protect women who potentially could be killed in the process of an abortion being performed on them. Now, someone rightly reminded me on Twitter that, of course, there was going to be a huge amount of control and regulation of women's bodies as part of this. You know, it's the Victorian period. The politicians love controlling women's bodies now, so they definitely love doing it in the 1800s. But it was at a time when abortion was incredibly dangerous. You know, there were no antibiotics, all abortions were surgical abortions, and if you started bleeding to death, then there was nothing anyone could do other than, you know, hope that you clotted on your own. So you can understand why at this time Parliament thought, well, actually we should make this illegal because it's dangerous for women. There wasn't this same sense that fetuses are who should be protected, and this is what the purpose of the legislation is.
Okay, so I know during your research you basically read the judgments, you know, in the sentencing, the court transcripts of cases. Can you tell me a bit about the comments that you read, and what that told you during your research, and what it says to you about perhaps the way that women who end their pregnancies are being viewed by the criminal justice system?
Yeah, absolutely. I was quite shocked by a lot of what I read. So throughout the cases, there's this real sense that the women are mothers simply because they're pregnant. This sense that because they are mothers, they should be putting the welfare of their baby before themselves. Bearing in mind the crisis pregnancy that I've previously been talking about is what is the context of this woman's pregnancy. And in some of these cases, that crisis was very much being talked about, and was the barristers, as they were making their arguments, were aware of the crisis. But that didn't seem to interrupt this notion that women are natural mothers and should do everything they can to put the baby's needs first. So, for example, in Hayley's case, there was lots of talk in there about how she'd been pregnant before, so she should have recognized the signs of pregnancy, therefore she knew what she was doing, and she must have done what she did intentionally. Now, again, Hayley had 4 pregnancies where she, for some reason, couldn't recognize the signs of pregnancy until very late, so clearly a level of crisis going on there for one reason or another. In Tanya's case, so Tanya's the 16-year-old girl who gave birth on her own after the crisis pregnancy. So Tanya was impregnated after being raped. So she was 16, he was about 22 or 23, which always raises a question in my mind as to why is a 22 or 23-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old, but that's probably a discussion for another webinar. Now, in the trial, sorry, beg your pardon, it wasn't a trial because she pleaded guilty. In the sentencing hearing, her barrister made it very clear that she was only raped in her head. Legally, she wasn't raped. And there was very much the sense that she'd encouraged this man to have sex with her. So, you know, obviously massive issues there that we could probably, again, spend another webinar talking about. But despite all of this, and despite the fact that the reason why her crisis stemmed from being raped, and every time she thought about the pregnancy, she relived the rape. So we're talking about a woman, a girl who's in a huge amount of trauma. Despite all of this, you know, the judge, when sentencing her, is still saying things like, you should have told people you were pregnant, you should have done this. And you just look at it and you think, well, yes, in an ideal situation, that's exactly what she would have done. But this is a girl who was suffering severe trauma. Is it really surprising that she didn't act in the best interest of her baby?
Well, and in essence, what the evidence says and what she was saying was every time she spoke about it, she relived the rape. So that's why she didn't speak about it. That's why, you know, so she'd been punished twice, obviously, as we well know. You know, and it's and I think you've used this phrase before, and I'm gonna steal it off you. It's the wrong sort of pregnancy and the wrong sort of woman.
Absolutely.
You know, it's a patriarchal sort of throughput of that kind of mentality that, you know, women should always put the fetus first, even if they have, you know, like Tanya's case, have been, you know, brutalized, and that's why they have actually ended up as pregnant in the first place. I'm wondering, in that case, did the father of that fetus get mentioned at all in the sentence? Or?
Oh, I can't remember for that particular case, but there were definitely other cases where men were considered victims of what the woman had done. So there was definitely a case of a woman who was convicted of concealment of birth, who they don't know how the baby died. and she became pregnant after a one-night stand, and they tracked the man who got her pregnant down through his DNA, and then cited him as a victim. And thankfully, I mean, this is the one thing, because every so often you read this and you go, thank God for some of these defense barristers, because one of the defense barrister turned around and was like, well, he didn't give her a backward look when he left on, the morning after. Why on earth are we seeing him as a victim of what's happened here? This is absolute nonsense. So there's some worrying comments being said about the men in these cases. They're generally seen as victims, not perpetrators. But I think just, picking up on what you've said about the wrong type of women and the wrong type of pregnancy, it's really poignant here and really apparent from what's being said in these sentencing hearings. But in addition to that, I think there's a wider question that feeds into, why are we criminalizing women in these circumstances? And again, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about this sense that women are equal to men means women are equally to blame when we do bad things, and we must do them for very similar reasons to why men do them. These situations, these crises, they're caused by the patriarchy, right? The 16-year-old girl, if she hadn't been raped, she wouldn't have been traumatized. She wouldn't have become pregnant because she wouldn't have been raped, which means she wouldn't have been in that situation. And Hayley's case, there were very complex situations around her relationship there, her relationship with her husband. She was pregnant after an extramarital affair, scared about what her husband would say, which I know some people would say, well, she shouldn't have been having an affair. But equally, these are social constructions around whose baby should you be pregnant with, when should you be pregnant. It's a context of patriarchy that results in this, right? And yet, rather than us looking at this and saying, well, okay, fine, it's a product of patriarchy, therefore is it right that we punish women under men's laws? Because of course women didn't create and write any of these laws. Women aren't most of the judges, women aren't even most of the barristers. Is that the right approach? Or actually, do we need to be thinking about this in terms of, should we have a different approach to women, considering the fact that in this situation particularly, women's crimes are being caused by the patriarchy?
Yeah, absolutely. So explain to me the through line between the criminalisation of ending a pregnancy and the fetus first mentality.
Yeah, so one of the key things that came out of the sentencing hearings was, as I've talked about already, this sense that the women should have done everything they could have to protect their baby, to be a good mother. Again, that was completely ignoring the crisis that these women were in. So this sense of the fetus is the most important being in this context was just laden throughout. There was nobody in any of these cases looked at it and went, well, this woman was in crisis, so you can understand why the fetus wasn't the priority. Throughout all of these cases, that was the focus, is you could have saved this baby. Now, as I've already talked about, legally, the fetus doesn't have the same rights as the woman. We have the born alive rule. It's meant to be upheld. And so we should be in a situation where essentially the woman is being seen to be legally a more important entity than the baby, her unborn baby, her fetus. And yet that's not the case, and that's not what's going on. So one of the conclusions I come to from the data analysis and that I come to in the book is that essentially these criminal offences of procuring a miscarriage and concealment of birth are being used as proxies for fetal homicide laws. So we can't have fetal homicide laws in this country because we have the born alive rule. So we can't see the victim as a fetus of homicide in the same way as we can see a baby that's been born alive as a fetus of homicide. This is unlike in the US, where in most states, I believe in every state in the US, the fetus can be the victim of homicide. Different states do it in different ways, and some states actively say women can't be prosecuted under these laws. So they kind of safeguard women from criminalization in that way. In other states, they don't safeguard women. And what we have seen is women being arrested, detained, and forced to have medical intervention on the basis that the fetus is an equal legal subject, and therefore the woman is breaking the law, committing homicide if she does something that harms that fetus.
Have you got some examples of those kinds of cases in the US that you can tell me about?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are so many examples.
There must be hundreds.
Some of these have made the news over here, so some of you might recognise them. The Guardian always tend to be quite good at reporting these sorts of cases. So there was a case from not all that long ago of a woman who was pregnant, while pregnant, got into a bar fight, and the woman who she was fighting shot her in the abdomen, which caused her baby to die, her fetus to die. She was then arrested for manslaughter on the basis that she had provoked the person who attacked her and therefore was culpable for the death of her baby. Now, again, thankfully, though she was released, she wasn't charged, but she only wasn't charged because when they examined the law, they realized the law doesn't work like that. So she was released on a technicality, not because someone thought, actually, this is a terrible thing to do to a woman. There's another example of a woman who fell down the stairs while she was pregnant. She went to hospital because she was bleeding. And during the course of that examination, she told the nurse that she'd thought about having an abortion. The hospital then made the assumption that she had purposely thrown herself down the stairs in order to end the pregnancy. And so they phoned the police and she was arrested. Now, the only reason she wasn't charged is because in the state that she was in, which I think off the top of my head was Iowa, I might be wrong about that, the fetal homicide law that they have only operates after the second trimester, and she was still, or I think, she was still in the second trimester, and it operates off into the third trimester. So again, it was a legal technicality that meant that she wasn't actually imprisoned for that. But there's other cases, a woman who attempted to take her own life. She survived, but her unborn baby did not. She was then arrested for murder. Unfortunately, these examples go on and on and on. And what's really worrying about this is, firstly, two things. The impact on women's rights, which is just terrifying, because you can end up in a situation where conduct that would be legal for women if they weren't pregnant becomes illegal because they are pregnant. So, for example, certain states criminalize the taking of controlled substances if you're pregnant. So that would obviously be your illegal drugs, such as your heroin, but it would also be your legal drugs. So all of a sudden, simply because you become pregnant, the conduct that would be legal, taking these legal controlled substances, becomes illegal. That's incredibly dangerous and worrying. But we can also very clearly see a through line in the US between the construction of the fetus as a victim of crime and the sense that abortion shouldn't be legal. Because if you're saying, well, fetuses are victims and it's really bad if people kill them, fetal homicide laws, why on earth would you let a woman have an abortion even at the earliest stage? Because if it's illegal to do it then, why isn't it illegal to do it when she's only 12 weeks pregnant, for example? But there's an added difficulty that if a woman is scared she's going to be arrested, she doesn't go to the hospital. Like, we already know this is the case, right? If women are worried that, say, perhaps they do take illegal substances, and if they think that they're going to have the police phoned on them, they just avoid medical care for the entirety of their pregnancy. Now, the one thing we do know is that if women don't receive medical care during their pregnancy, that's incredibly dangerous for both them and their unborn baby. So actually what we want is women who are in difficult situations, we want them to get medical help. We want them to be supported, right? Criminalizing them doesn't protect them, and it doesn't protect their unborn babies. And I know there's real concern amongst the medical communities here in the UK that after the woman who was imprisoned in June, after her case, women who do take medication illegally, rather than seeking medical care, if they, for example, are bleeding quite heavily, they're going to be scared that the doctors are going to phone the police, the nurses are going to phone the police, and they're just not going to seek that medical care. And obviously that's incredibly dangerous, because if a woman is hemorrhaging, we definitely want her going to hospital.
Well, and of course it has a knock-on effect, and I wanted to ask you about your views on the most recent case of the woman who ended her own pregnancy at 30+ weeks, and how her case fits in with your research. But one of the things that you can notice is actually, because it's, rightly so, hit the media, and, obviously we're talking about it, we're having, this webinar, You know, is there a fear that that obviously does put women off because they can see women in crisis or, you know, similar circumstances to them being criminalized, and therefore they don't come forward, or they, you know, and obviously their health is at risk and that of the fetus. Would you say that that's true? The more it comes to kind of media attention.
Yeah, this is kind of one of those double-edged sword things, right? Because a lot of people who the crime control people actually think it's a good thing, because then women don't do it in the first place, which, you know,
that's not how crisis works, is it?
No, I know. They're really missing a step there. They're like, well, we should criminalize. Like, it's really good that that case happened, because a woman who's thinking about having an illegal abortion will stop in the future because she's seen what happens to this woman. You're like, yeah, you're right. That's how crisis works.
Yeah.
Like, oh, the crisis has disappeared because I never go to jail.
Sorry, I interrupted you there, Emma, but I suppose it's going back to that point of that there's an awful lot of people out there that think that women are getting pregnant just or maliciously having you know, late term terminations or ending their own pregnancy or concealing them, you know, in being completely lucid and compos mentis and, you know, seeking to do it, but that's not the case, is it? So that's where their kind of, I suppose, rationale is, well, then everybody else will be put off that desperately wants to do this, but that just isn't what is happening.
Yeah,
yeah. But tell me what your views are on that case and how that kind of fit with your research and what you found.
Yeah, I mean, there's only a limited amount I can say, because I've seen as much as anyone else has, which is media coverage and then the sentencing remarks which were published. Certainly, the sentencing remarks, they would suggest a similar line of thinking from the judge to the previous sentencing remarks that I've looked at, which is this sense that the fetus is a victim. The fetus is perhaps not an equivalent victim to a baby who's been born alive, but pretty close. And that procuring a miscarriage is a crime against a fetus, which it really was never meant to be a crime against a fetus. That's not where it comes from. And this is, I mean, I just want to say here, one of the things that I don't do and I don't believe in doing is blaming the criminal justice professionals, right? The CPS, the barristers, the judges, because they're working with what they've got. And what they've got is a modern interpretation of old pieces of legislation that are not very well used. So one of the arguments that I keep seeing against the archaic, you know, we need to reform abortion laws because they're archaic. One of the arguments that I've seen against that is, well, there's other archaic pieces of legislation on the statute book. So, for example, the criminal offence of grievous bodily harm, GBH, and actual bodily harm, ABH, they sit in the same act as procuring a miscarriage. So the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. So I've seen lots of people saying, well, we don't have any problems applying that piece of law, even though that's just as old. I think that the thing I would say back to that is, since the 1861 Act was written, GBH and ABH have been charged multiple times across the country every single day, except maybe Christmas Day. I don't know, do they charge on Christmas Day? But you get my point. Like, they are used so frequently, so there's never going to be a chance that they forget the meaning and the purpose of those pieces of legislation. Whereas procuring a miscarriage, 2012 was the first time a woman was charged with that piece of legislation for a good 50 plus years. Now, 50 years is a really long time.
Yeah, so there's a definite uptick in the trend of women being prosecuted under these crimes. And you know, I hear a lot and you know, see a lot about, well, you know, the UK is not the US. You know, we don't have to worry about that over here. It's not the same thing. But you know, and I, you know, I'm not putting you on the spot here, but well, I am actually, because we're in a webinar. But what do you say to that in terms of the trajectory of what you see? So, you know, we can see that these laws are now being used for these purposes. And then, you know, you've given some really good, horrific examples of what's happening in the US. What's the trajectory for us here as feminists, you know, as women defending reproductive rights and sex-based rights? You know, can you see that trend is coming from, you know, maybe the US, or you know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the US is obviously on acceleration. They always tend to be when this happens, and they do have a heavily politicized debate around abortion. But we still have a politicized debate around abortion. I think the fact that it's what's that? My brain's gone. In Parliament, it's a conscious vote. Is that the phrase I'm looking for? Yeah. So it's, you know, that I think that in and of itself indicates that it's political for us as well. It's not the kind of straightforward thing that people often think. We do have a very active anti-abortion rights movement. They are pretty well funded. A lot of that funding is coming from the US. A lot of the activity for that is coming from the US, and that is something that is definitely growing. So I think there's concern there. But I also think we have adopted a lot of the rhetoric. Some of it's come out of the US, but some of it's actually come direct from us, around the sense of what it means to be pregnant, and around the rights and the sense of what is a fetus. So you think, you know, 50 odd years ago, I think it's about 50 years now, it might be 60 years. 60 years ago, the sonogram was created, right? Which allowed us the first opportunity to see what was going on inside a woman's body when she was pregnant. Prior to that, the understanding of the conceptualization of pregnancy was very different, because you quite literally couldn't see it until it was born. When you can see it, the baby, it becomes a very different entity for very understandable reasons. And our sense of how a woman should behave when she's pregnant has also changed and also developed. So another example of this is the guidance that we have here in the UK around how much a woman should drink while she's pregnant. So back in 1999, the guidance was essentially, don't get drunk. It's going to be really bad for the baby if you get drunk, so please don't do that. Now, the guidance is there is no safe amount of alcohol to drink while you're pregnant, so don't drink anything at all. Now, that is such a misleading piece of guidance, because the reason why we don't know if there's a safe limit for drinking alcohol is because we obviously don't test women. Like, that would be so unethical to be like, well, you drink 6 pints a night and you drink 3, and we'll see if one of the babies doesn't come out very well. Like, we're not going to do that research for very understandable reasons. But there's no evidence that a really small amount of alcohol is actually going to do any harm to a baby. And yet the guidance is still, don't drink anything at all. It's not, we don't know, but there's no evidence that a small amount of alcohol does any harm. So we have this growing sense of the responsibilization of the pregnant woman. You're pregnant, you're a mother, you need to be a good mother, which means you need to be a responsible mother, which means you need to do everything you can to put the well-being of the baby first. And I mean, just as another example of something that I was just horrified. This was during my PhD, this came out, and I was horrified when I saw it. In Scotland, one of the local authority, public health authorities in Scotland, produced some guidance. It was about 2016, I think it was, that was, they wanted every single healthcare professional to ask any person of reproductive age, and they were quite clever to make it sex neutral, of any person, but really they meant women, right? Any person of reproductive age, is there a chance you could get pregnant this forthcoming year? Not, do you want to? Is there any chance? Which, unless you've had like a hysterectomy, the answer to that is yes. Because, you know, unfortunately, even women who don't have sex with men, there's an unfortunate, really quite high chance that you might be raped, right? So it's a horribly worded thing to say to women. Is there any chance? Anyway, there was then this like list. If the answer was yes, here are all the things women should do. And it was like, stop drinking, stop taking drugs, don't get Zika virus, leave your abusive partner, and what was the other one that was really, don't get HIV, or, you know, sort your HIV out, or something like that. But it wasn't on the basis of, do you want to get pregnant? It was on the basis of, is there a possibility you could? So this sense that women are simply carriers of future human life in the embodiment of the fetus is definitely with us. This is not something that's just over in America that we can ignore. It's with us. And that is being replicated and being felt throughout the criminal justice system, and how they respond to these women in crisis. So the women in crisis are at the very end of the spectrum of what we see is the controlling of all women in relation to their pregnancy. You're on mute, love.
Sorry, that's probably a good thing, because I think I just swore about the list. That's just crazy, isn't it?
The thing that drove me mad about that list, right, is it's probably not bad health advice. Like, it'd be great if women left their abusive partners, but it's the way it's being represented as the only reason to do it is because you might get pregnant. I mean, that's horrendous. Your value to us is purely your reproductive function. That's straight out of bloody Gilead and The Handmaid's Tale.
Well, in essence, if you might get pregnant, stay at home, lock all the doors, don't do anything.
But don't drink any wine.
Don't drink any wine, yeah. So, what's the legal reform that you would like to see? What would you like? What are you campaigning for, and also what are the next steps, and how can we all help you?
Yeah, so the big thing I want so many things, but the big one that's really pertinent for this conversation is the repealing of section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act, which are the pieces of legislation that are related to procuring a miscarriage. So one is the procuring of the miscarriage itself, and the other one is the provision of drugs. And then section 60 of concealment of birth, I would also add that in there, because unfortunately, if we only decriminalise abortion, if a woman does this and then she hides the dead body, she could still be criminalised. She's just been criminalised for hiding the dead body rather than for the abortion itself. So those would be the pieces of legislation that I would say we just absolutely have to go. The Infant Life Preservation Act, which is from 1929, that has the criminal offence of child destruction. Haven't talked about that, but very happy to in questions if anybody would like us to. That I think also needs to go. So that is the ending of the life of a child capable of being born alive. This is another very old piece of legislation where the meaning of it and the purpose of it when enacted has been lost. And it's the closest thing we've got to a fetal homicide law. That one's a bit scarier. The differences between procuring a miscarriage and child destruction, it's quite hard to prove child destruction. It's easier to prove procuring a miscarriage. But if we get rid of procuring a miscarriage and we don't get rid of child destruction, I think there's quite a good chance that they'll start using child destruction instead. So that one I think needs to go as well. In terms of what we can do, well, I have a website for the project that I've been doing. It's on the Durham University page. I think it's going to be shared in the chat. You can go on there, and I've got a great video animation that's connected to the research, so please feel free to watch that and enjoy the beautiful animation. It really is stunning. There's also a link to a sign up page so you can get updates on what's happening with the campaign and how things are going. And then also on the same website, on a different page, are some briefings. So one of the things you can absolutely do is you can write to your MP and you can tell your MP that it is time that Parliament steps in and does something about these pieces of legislation. We can't leave them sitting on the books because, as I've already outlined, the Crown Prosecution Service and the judges are interpreting them in the ways they want to, and that's really dangerous for women, and it's really dangerous for unborn babies as well. So write to your MP, feel free to download my briefings and send my briefings to them. I am always happy to talk to members of Parliament. I email them all quite a lot anyway to tell them that, but feel free to tell your member of Parliament that I will happily brief them on the core issues and why it's something that Parliament should be paying attention to.
Thank you so much, Emma. And yeah, I can vouch for the fact that Emma's website is absolutely brilliant. You do some really great videos as well, which is really useful because you can listen to them while you're doing other stuff. Not that you haven't, that I wouldn't watch your face all the time, but have it on in the background. Right, I'm going to open up for questions. So I've got some questions here. In Northern Ireland, where the 1861 and 1929 Acts don't apply, but the general principles of the 1967 Act have been adopted, what would be the legal situation? What would the legal situation be for a medical practitioner who undertook an abortion outside what the 67 Act framework allows? And what would be the situation for the woman in that case?
Yeah, okay, so I definitely need to put a precursor on this that I don't look at Northern Ireland. I very much look at England and Wales. That is my area of expertise. So hopefully I don't get this wrong. There's some great works that I tell you. So one of my colleagues, I'm actually going to suggest you look up because she does great work around Northern Ireland. Her name's Jane Rooney. She's at Durham University. Hopefully the amazing people at Women's Place are going to go Google her now and drop her profile into the chat. She does look at abortion in Northern Ireland. So she will be a much better person to answer this question. Without her being here, my understanding is that the current law in Northern Ireland means that no woman can be criminalised for ending her own pregnancy, regardless of the time during the pregnancy that she does it. But I believe medical professionals who end a woman's pregnancy outside of the parameters of the law, and I think that's at any stage of gestation, I think they still can be criminalised. Definitely after 24 weeks they can, but I think even before 24 weeks, if they don't give the abortion in relation to the law, then they can still be criminalised. And that, so again, I'm drifting into areas that are not my expertise, and I don't really like doing this. But the one thing I will say, although if we remove women from the criminal law around abortion, we get everything that I'm talking about today ends, except for the concealment of birth thing. We've got to do that too. But if we don't remove doctors, I know this from the British Medical Association, it has a chilling effect for doctors, right? So doctors don't want to train for OBGYN, and they don't want to involve themselves in women's health because of the legal ramifications that they just don't have in other areas of practice. So it has a real chilling effect for doctors, and I'm sure the same is true for midwives, right? So it means that we don't get the best people who would otherwise want to help women. It also means that as we have medical developments that would change the way in which we understand contraception and abortion, those medical developments can't be brought in as quickly as they could be if the abortion didn't sit within the criminal law. So a clear example of this would be telemedical abortion. We could have brought that in years before we actually did, but we weren't allowed to because abortion's a crime. And therefore, if we provided abortion in that way, women and the doctors would be breaking the law. We had to wait for Parliament to change the law in order to be able to bring in what was a medical advancement for women.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question here. Is there any specific legislation under which a male can be charged if he harms a fetus, or is this solely a female crime? And I know you and I have chatted about this before. Given the context of my work, it's like, okay, so what would be the consequence if we removed all of those pieces of legislation for a perpetrator of male violence when he deliberately kills the fetus as part of the abuse? So firstly, is this a female specific crime? And secondly, what would be your answer to that? What's your solution to that for those men that would do that?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. So thank you for that. Both procuring a miscarriage and child destruction can be committed by any person. So it's not just the pregnant woman. It can also be by third parties. So they could be medical professionals, but they could also be men attacking pregnant women. And this is a real problem, right? Men attacking pregnant women is a real problem, because we know that when a woman becomes pregnant, either the violence and abuse can escalate or it can start. So that can be the real trigger for the violence and abuse. So it's a dangerous time for women when they're pregnant. And we need the criminal law to acknowledge that, right? And to do something about that, because hopefully that would be a deterrent, but also we need to punish men when they are violent towards women. And I can completely understand why people would want to understand and see the fetus as a victim in a circumstance where a man attacks a woman while she's pregnant, resulting in the death of the fetus and potentially also the death of the woman. I can totally understand why that's a position that people think the criminal law should take. And that's certainly where a lot of the fetal homicide laws in the US originated from, this sense of if a man's killed a woman who's pregnant, there's two victims there, right? It's not just the woman. The problem is, in exactly the same ways I've already been talking about tonight, as soon as you acknowledge or see the fetus as a victim, you create the situation where, well, if this fetus is a victim of this man's crime, why would the fetus not be a victim of a woman's crime if she does something while she's pregnant, including ending her own pregnancy, or in fact, just having any abortion, right? So opening up the floodgates to the fetus can also be a victim, it puts our rights in just such a dangerous situation. So my preference for the criminal law would be that we don't have a situation where we are considering the fetus or even the pregnancy the victim of crime, and instead we are acknowledging the reality that when men attack women, whether or not they're pregnant, they're attacking a woman, right? And if she's pregnant and she loses that pregnancy, she obviously has not only the damage that's been done to herself physically and mentally, but she then has the added damage and the added harm of she's lost her baby. That absolutely needs to be acknowledged. But there are ways we can do that without creating the fetus as a victim. So we can enhance the sentencing guidance to say that men who do this would be sentenced, where they would receive a greater sentence. And we could even do that if the man also kills the woman as well as the fetus. He could receive, he would obviously, if it's murder, he'd get a mandatory life sentence anyway, but we could say that he has to spend extra time in prison before he would be available to take parole. So yes, it's really important, but we need to really think through how we use the criminal law to protect pregnant women, and saying that the fetus is a victim is just not the way to do it.
This opens the floodgates to all the things that we've been talking about and that we can see happening in America and now over here.
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting question here. Why do you think there was a gap in the use of the old legislation? What's changed? You know, you mentioned 2012. You know, what do you think's changed there? Because that's quite strange, isn't it? That, you know, it's only fairly recently that it's been started to use again. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that I'm probably going to scratch my head about for a couple of days. I think the growing sense that fetuses are, or unborn babies, again, language there, are as important as pregnant women, if not more important. That's definitely something we've seen growing over time. And certainly the number of NHS trusts that now have safeguarding policies for fetuses, that's growing all the time. That's something that we just didn't see 20 years ago. It would never occur to an NHS trust to safeguard a fetus. You wouldn't believe how many of them now do. And as soon as you start writing into policies that fetuses should be safeguarded, even though legally they shouldn't, right? There's no legal basis for that. You start changing the dynamics of what you see and you understand as what should be criminal behavior and what shouldn't be criminal behavior. And so in Hayley's case, it's Hayley's case that dates back to 2012. She was reported to the police by the medical professionals who knew she was pregnant, knew she hadn't been able to obtain an abortion and were expecting to see a baby. And then when they didn't see a baby, and when she avoided going in to see her GP, to see her midwife or her healthcare visitor after when she would have given birth, they phoned the police because they thought there was a baby missing. And so I think there's a growing sense of surveillance of pregnant women and pregnant women not doing what we're expecting and wanting them to do. And unfortunately, that's being accompanied by, within certain NHS trusts, medical staff reporting women to the police. And it's one of those things that when you start looking out for behavior because you're expecting to see it, you see it all the time, right? Like you can identify it. It's a very similar aspect to the reason why Black and brown men are more likely to have something found on them when they're stopped and searched. It's not that Black and brown men carry things more prevalently than white men. It's because the police stop and search Black and brown men more than they stop and search white men, right? So if your medical professionals are on the lookout for this and are prepared to report to the police, they're going to find it and they're going to see it. Whereas 20 odd years ago, I don't think they were looking out for it.
It's really interesting, thank you. So I've probably got time for one more question. Yeah, there's a question here around, do you think there'll be an appeal in the sentence of the recent case, the woman?
I can't, unfortunately, I can't comment on that. I mean, I don't know enough about the case, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on it either.
No, that's fine. So what about this one? So do two doctors still have to authorise any abortion, either via abortion drugs or aspiration, how can this change? So I think that's quite specific, isn't it, to the UK? It's not actually the way it happens in other countries. Can you say a little bit more about that?
No, and I'm pretty certain that is the whole of the UK. So it's England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. 2 doctors do have to sign off, although it might not be Northern Ireland anymore. They might, again, I don't know the law in Northern Ireland very well. Certainly in England and Wales, that's the case. Yeah, I mean, it's mad, isn't it? Because if you need an abortion and you phone up a provider, you will probably, unless you are very late in term or you've got very complicated health conditions that mean that it's right for you to have care from a doctor, you probably never come in contact with a doctor at all. You'll talk to another medical professional, but in the background 2 doctors will review your notes and sign it off, and legally they can't give you that medication, they can't give you that abortion without that happening, which is, I mean, and it's insane because, so I know, and again we're getting outside of my area of research, but I know that midwives are able to perform vacuum evacuations for women who've had stillbirth. So on like a Monday, they'll be in their NHS hospital performing DNCs on women who've had stillbirth. On a Tuesday, they'll go and work in an abortion clinic. And because they're not a doctor, they're not allowed to perform exactly the same procedure on a woman having an abortion than they would perform on a woman who has a stillbirth. It's insane, but it's all because of how the law is constructed. And the reality is, if we simply decriminalise abortion, if we get rid of these archaic pieces of legislation, that all goes away, because the medical professionals will do what the medical professionals do well, which is work out how's the best way to provide this medical care. And actually, probably what we'll see is a lot of this medical care will go to midwives. They are generally in a better place to do it. Obviously, you're much further along. Terminations will be conducted by doctors because, you know, they're more complicated. They're potentially going to be surgical, in which case it would make sense for your doctors are going to carry on doing those. But, you know, pretty much all other abortions, particularly the early medical abortions, absolutely wouldn't have doctors involved. It's only because of this legislation.
So, and that kind of brings us nicely to a close around your campaign, isn't it? Because really what your message is around help, not harm, so that those women that are in deep crisis won't be fearful about coming forward, and we can, you know, prevent them having to go through this awful situation and create more trauma. Would you say that was what you're aiming for effectively, is that we need these women to come forward? Yeah, absolutely. And we need them to come forward without fear. And we also, I think we need to acknowledge the context in which they do these not great things. I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, it's perfectly okay for a woman to end a pregnancy at 32 weeks. Like, different people will have different perceptions on that. I have my own. I'm not sharing them here because they're personal. This is just on the basis of my research, so what I'm talking about here today. But to say we need to decriminalise abortion and we need to stop criminalise women is not to say that we think it's perfectly okay for women to have abortions. No, I don't think anyone's saying. No, precisely. But I think it's often we're being misrepresented as that is what we believe and that is what we think. That's Absolutely. Not the case. That's not what's been advocated. And it's also not what's going to happen. You know, if we decriminalise abortion, women aren't going to suddenly at 38 weeks go, do you know what, I've changed my mind, I don't want to be pregnant anymore. And they're going to trot down to their local GP and go, I'd like an abortion. And the doctors and nurses aren't suddenly going to go, fine, well, it's not illegal anymore, so of course we'll give you an abortion at 38 weeks. It's just not going to happen. So this is about not criminalising the women who are in the most vulnerable situations and positions. And the criminal law has always had this discretion. This sense that we always criminalise things that are done that are bad is not true, right? There's loads of situations where someone breaks the law or someone does something that might not be illegal, but we don't think it's necessarily good, and we don't criminalise it on spec. We wouldn't want the criminal law to operate like that. So my question is then, why are we criminalising these incredibly vulnerable women? We shouldn't be doing it. Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I hope that we can chat again in the future. I know you're doing some work around infanticide, which is also, you know, absolutely, you know, fascinating and another really worrying topic. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to the women behind the scenes who are doing everything. And obviously this will be up on the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to view it if you haven't already. If you can donate to Women's Place, please do. And yes, thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thanks for your time, Emma.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting.
Make sure you follow Emma on Twitter because she's great.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.